So we're about to start our last session before lunch, session 2, cities taking the lead. And it's a great pleasure to introduce you to my colleague who will be facilitating this session, Amollo Ambole, who is the program director of a new partnership initiative of ACC called the African Mayoral Leadership Initiative, which has commenced this year and will involve bringing 15 to 20 African mayors to UCT every year for an intensive leadership forum over 4 days and then monthly sessions for another 8 months. And the attempt of this program is to both support but also to encourage and foreground city leaders across the continent as the people that will drive the change. And what is this program is a joint initiative between Big Win Philanthropies that Amollo works for and ACC, but she has a strong academic background from Nairobi, and so we've adopted her into ACC as well, so she's got a dual identity. But I'm going to hand you over into the capable hands of Amollo and looking forward to the panel. Thank you. Sorry, sure. One correction that I forgot to make, my apology. So I was asked by Mr. Morris Mbolela, who's the Deputy Secretary General of UCLG Africa, to tender his apology. He had confirmed to come, flight was booked, and then his partner had an accident, and they have no extended support networks in Rabat, where he's just moved to. And so he's nominated to stay with his partner instead of making the trip, as he should have. On very short notice, one of the adjunct professors of ACC, Andrew Boraine, who's got vast experience in dealing with the complexities of multi-level governance and stitching together difficult relationships, agreed to join the panel. So there's just a deviation from the printed program and apology tendered. So sorry, Amollo, that I forgot to do that.
Thank you, Edgar, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this session titled Cities Taking the Lead in the Sustainable Infrastructure Transition. Allow me to quickly introduce my fellow panelists. We have with us Mayor Manuel de Araújo, who has been the mayor of the city of Quelimane for over a decade. This is a city in Mozambique. Welcome, Manuel. We also have with us Mthobeli Kolisa, who is the Executive Director of Infrastructure at the South African Local Governments Association, in short, SALGA. Welcome, Mthobeli. And then lastly, we also have Andrew, who's the outgoing Executive Director of the Economic Development Partnership. And as we've been told, he's also an adjunct professor at the ACC. Welcome, Andrew. So, colleagues, allow me to just share a few thoughts on the work that we are doing for cities to set the context and then invite you to share learnings from your experience and expertise. So, cities. Why cities? Manuel, why are we talking about cities? Why are cities so important to us? Over the last 2 days, I'm sure we've adequately dealt with this question, and now we have the people who work for cities and with cities to really speak from experience. How many of us in the room live in a city? How many of us would consider ourselves first or second or third or even third generation city dwellers? Right? So there's very good representation in this room, and I'm sure we can agree on this first point that cities need to be leading the sustainable infrastructure transition. If that is the case, then the other question is, how do we transform our cities and neighborhoods to catalyze green industrialization and a hands-on form of substantive citizenship? I don't have the answer to this question, but we have our very capable colleagues to speak to these challenges. We've already had quite a bit about how we make our cities successful. we first heard about the soft infrastructures. And here, just to pause, when I was on the flight coming here from Nairobi to Cape Town, I sat next to Quantity Surveyor Mutiso, who works on infrastructure in Mombasa. And when he saw me typing soft infrastructures, he asked me, what do you mean by soft infrastructures? And I told him, I don't know, I'm just the chair of the session. And over this 5-hour flight, he went on to challenge me over every concept about this conference. And Edgar, I tried my best to speak on behalf of the organizers, but I don't think I answered the questions adequately. But Muchiso, I told you, I have the experts, and now we'll be able to adequately deal with these questions. I believe also the panelists we had earlier this morning have been able to speak very well to this discussion. They've talked to us about the people, the culture, the beauty, the aesthetics. And I had other words that I also didn't know the meaning of, like transformative leisure economies and designing social infrastructures that give us an accessible future. Again, very adequately spoken to by the experts in the room. We've also heard that we need sound data and analytics to make our cities function. And most importantly, of course, we need the resources and the money. And I'm sure, Mayor, you can tell us exactly how much money you need to make Quelimane more successful. So we are really looking...
All the money available.
All the money available. Let's speak about that and speak also about the resources required to make our cities more successful. And what's the grounding? What's the grounding for these soft and hard infrastructures? Do we need to also be thinking critically about the legal and policy frameworks that will enable and sustain decentralization? And what better way to illustrate how policy frameworks for decentralization play out in the real world than through the work of SALGA? So we are really looking forward to Mthobeli talking to us about how SALGA is accelerating the uptake of more sustainable approaches to infrastructure investment at municipal level right here in South Africa. The big question is, who are we doing this for? What is policy if it doesn't represent the voice of the people? And from our previous panels, we've also had a very big conversation about the grassroots approach and how we make sure that the aspirations of our constituents are catered to when we are talking about the large-scale programs in infrastructure development. And as I now invite my colleagues to reflect on this and other very important questions, let me finish off with just a few insights on the work that Edgar has alluded to that we are doing together as the African Center for Cities and Big Win Philanthropy to support cities in their work and as they grapple with these challenges. Edgar, this is not a sales pitch, as you had asked us not to, but I'm not doing that. So Amollo is the African Mayoral Leadership Initiative, which, as Edgar has said, is a partnership between these two organizations. And from the very beginning, we've been very ambitious about how we want to support cities. We strongly believe that with bold visions and the right support, African city leaders can set their cities on a trajectory to thrive for generations to come. How did we get here? Well, in January 2021, I joined Big Win Philanthropy as the inaugural program director for this initiative. And my first task was to really understand the landscape, to do some scoping so that we can know what is actually happening in cities across the continent. One of the big questions we were asking is, what authorities do mayors have? And I remember very keenly speaking to Manuel about what's happening in the city of Quelimane. From our research, we were hit by a very serious reality check. Cities all across the continent have limited authorities and resources, and as Manuel said, he needs all the money to make things different in his city. And so when we were looking around at what has been done, we also came upon the work of UCLGA. And UCLGA, from their CEE reporting of 2021 tells us that most African countries have an unfavorable institutional environment for cities to operate in. So in short, there's a lot more that needs to be done when it comes to supporting effective decentralization and devolution in Africa. And luckily, UCLJ is already doing quite a bit of work with the African Union to promote meaningful and substantive decentralization all across the continent. So for us, what followed this reality check is a very measured and well-informed optimism where we saw opportunity. And this opportunity is in working together with this constellation of thriving programs that are supporting cities all across the continent. And we see our particular niche being in providing exclusive tailored leadership support for mayors in Africa. In that quest, I'm glad to report that we now have 19 mayors from across 10 African countries who have signed up for our inaugural January forum. Can I get a big hand for that? Mayor Manuel is one of the participants we hope to host in here at the University of Cape Town. And so this is, I think, a great opportunity for me to let you speak about what you are doing for your city. And then, of course, it will be followed by the work that Mthobeli is doing in Salga. And, of course, Andrew will finish up for us on the experience he's garnered from leading partnerships with cities. Manuel, take it away.
Well,
Can I just have this question in the background? Yes, yesterday night, I sent all of them this question on WhatsApp. Hopefully, we'll be able to, in one way or another, answer to this. How can city governments in Africa be empowered and equipped to take on leadership and steer the transition towards sustainable infrastructure?
Oh. When I got that question, I was like, oh, should I write a book about it or what? Because it's like she wants the roadmap. But I mean, I will try to synthesize my thoughts about these topics. And I was happy when I received the question because last month I was invited at the launch of a city center at Cornell University in New York, in Ithaca. And we discussed basically the same stuff, meaning that, which makes me very happy, that universities are taking cities seriously. And the fact that UCT was a pioneer on that, now Cornell and other universities are kind of copying. The former mayor of Quito, my good friend, is now working at the University of Pennsylvania, was also invited to a city center. So universities are really taking us serious. Before, it was like a part-time job, which we had to do. I started this journey by default. As most things in my life, they just happen by default. Because I was living in London, and I was working for Amnesty International, and a friend said that, my parents have got a bit of money, and but she wanted to do something social. A business venture, a social one, whatever it means. So I made a few calls and we visited some countries, and one of them, of course, was my own city. For my bad luck, during the time I was there to try to implement, the mayor was sacked on corruption charges. And according to the law at that time, a new election had to be organized, and new people could run. And suddenly, people were asking me if I was going to run. I was like, no, I came here with a purpose, and then I go back to London. But and then the pressure started growing, and in my hometown, when people have got very interesting issues or very pressing issues, they come at 4 a.m. in the morning. They knock your door, like, oh, look, to deal with serious matters. And then I was at my parents, and my dad was like, why are all these people coming every day, like bishops, like priests and sheikhs, like different groups? I said, no, but they want me to run, but I'm not interested. Then my dad asked me, why did we send you to school? I said, of course, to study. He said, but study for what? I said, yeah, to improve my life. I was like, okay. So now that your life is improving and your city needs you, you are not ready. Well, after that conversation, I couldn't say no. So that's how I got into this thing of managing cities, which it has never passed through my mind. But the point I'm telling this story was that I didn't have a plan. And so when my dad asked me that, I couldn't say no. But I was like, we had only 2 months. So I said, well, in 2 months, I will not. Anyway, I will run, but I know that I will lose. So then I will continue with my plans, previous plans. Eventually, I won the election. So I was like, oh, come on. So now what do I do? The first thing I did was to assemble a team of university lecturers and stuff. So like, look, I need a boussole. I don't know what to do. I really didn't know. And my city is the capital, Quelimane is the capital of Zambezia province, which 1973, 1974, before our independence, which was 1975, this province of 6 million inhabitants was producing 35% of Mozambique GDP. So it was a thriving city. But because of the civil war that we had in Mozambique for 16 years, all the infrastructure, and because most of this wealth was coming from agriculture and agribusiness, was destroyed. So the city, of course, was in decline. So when I came in, everybody was like leaving the city, of course, going to Maputo.
Oh, in Maputo.
Thank you.
Please try again.
I will try. So, basically, to cut the story short, I had these pressing challenges. I didn't have the expertise, and the people were leaving the city. And I said, how can we revert this? As I said, I felt like a pilot, a Navy pilot or a ship pilot in a high sea during a storm or during a cyclone, and without a boussole. Like, you don't know if you pushed the ship to north, to south, to east, or to west. So I had to find my own instrument, at least for me to know where I was and where I wanted to go. So I assembled this small team of lecturers who were willing to think about my city. And we started from there. But what we realized was that the level of expectation, the level of the problems were so big that the powers that the Constitution were giving us as mayors were not enough. So the issue of institutional framework. The second thing we realized was that and we read a bit about, the history of Africa and so on. And one of common things that we found is that both groups of countries, because we had, during the Cold War, those who went to socialism, like Mozambique, Angola, and others, and those who tried to implement capitalism. But one of the characteristics of both groups of countries, with rare exceptions, were extreme centralization of the government. Therefore, the struggle of local governments, it's a struggle, one for power. Like talking about, that's why Trevor was here yesterday, shooting at us. Because his mindset is a central government. And the Constitution says, at least in my country, and in most countries, it's the job of national government to devolve power. So it's like you are asking somebody who wants power for himself to give to somebody else. Of course, he will find all kinds of excuses not to devolve power. And there are different ways to devolve power. It can be deconcentration, It can be devolution and so on. And if you look at most countries, they would attempt to give power back, though the laws, and in my country, the law states clearly that when power is devolved, it should be accompanied by human resources and financial resources, because somebody was doing that job. So if the task is passing from person A to person B, then the resources that the person A was using should be transferred to person B to be able of accomplishing what he was doing. But what happens is that governments, they give you the power, but they don't give you the human resources, not even the financial resources. That's challenge 2, lack of capacity. And I stress the issue of capacity, human capacity, or human resources, because if you have human resources, then you are able of identifying places, institutions to help you. You can enter into a dialogue. But if your human capacity is weak, you don't even know where to start from. You don't know who can help you. You don't know where to get the money. All those who are around who want to support you. So to me, the first challenge, if we want to empower cities, will be, of course, first of all, we need to look at the legal framework. Because without the legal framework, nothing can happen. We need to get the constitution right, the laws, bylaws, and so on. It needs to be a real legal framework aiming at decentralizing power, devolving power. Why devolving? I mean, we all know that the concept of the state, at least the one I sympathize with, is like, there were a bunch of people who could not run their city, whatever. Then they decided to choose a few of them to represent them and to run the city on their behalf. It's like a social contract. So we took the people's power, gave to a group. But now this group took that power. They don't want to give the power back. So it's a struggle for power. We need to understand that. If we don't understand that, then all this journey that you're making will be much more difficult. If we don't understand the nature of struggle we are involved, it will always be a struggle between those at the local level who want power for the purpose of developing and those who retain that power. They will always want to retain it. Unfortunately, there should be a third institution that should be there monitoring this process of transfer. It's the government tasked into devolving power that monitor itself if it's devolving or not. Of course, it will not work. Just to finish, to me, the role of academic institutions is of a paramount importance. As I mentioned before, I was at Cornell. They decided that they needed to create a city center. Here, University of Cape Town has got the African Center for Cities. But most of the time, this dialogue between those at local government and those with the knowledge, and by knowledge, I include in the package of knowledge data, know-how, and so on, most of the times, there is no communication. I mean, it's not the university's fault. I think that most of the times are those in the local government who are afraid of dealing with professors. I mean, there is also, but because I think that I'm coming from the academic background, it's easier for me to engage but when I talk to my colleagues, to my friends, most of the time, there is a kind of a resistance from both sides. So we need to kind of to streamline and make this dialogue. That's why I was so enthusiastic when Amollo invited me, and also for the great work that Edgar is making. So I just want to put this into highlights while we continue with our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for starting us off by unpacking these challenges. And I think a great way would be to move over and talk to the opportunities and perhaps the frameworks and tools that SALGA has been using to empower and equip leaders all across South Africa. And perhaps you could relate that also to what's happening in the rest of the continent.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Amollo. And good morning, colleagues. Thank you for inviting us to participate here. It's been quite an empowering experience to be in this conference. In preparing to respond to this question, I thought I should start by just to situate what we're trying to do on what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about sustainable infrastructure first. Then I will quickly touch on some of the things that we're doing in South Africa to draw lessons from. And then lastly, make 6 proposals about what is it that needs to be done to equip cities towards sustainable infrastructure. So quickly on the sustainable infrastructure, there are 4 elements that I want to anchor in terms of that. The one that I think all of us are familiar with is that when we talk about sustainable infrastructure, we talk about infrastructure that meets the needs of communities and socioeconomic development in general, taking into account inclusivity and the needs of future generations. That's generally what we've been working with. But with the world moving on and agreeing in terms of responding to climate change, agreeing that we may, as the world, tolerate a temperature rise up to 1.5%, we had then to say, what does it mean for infrastructure in terms of sustainability? That it should be infrastructure that can withstand climatic conditions that result from that 1.5 degrees, temperature rise. Because when it happens, it's going to have an impact. Thirdly, that it's got to be infrastructure that does not lead to the temperatures rising beyond this 1.5 degrees. So it's got to mitigate climate change. The 4th element being that it should take into account that the way we invest in infrastructure, if it is going to be sustainable, it should take into account institutional, community, and socioeconomic development sustainability. I'm going to talk more about the institutional sustainability, particularly from the point of view of municipalities. That is in a context of the world that is transitioning. What does it mean for us in investing in infrastructure if the world is transitioning to a low-carbon economy? Would be the 4th element, which we have not in the past been dealing with a lot. Now, just on that 4th element, I want to say, when we talk about infrastructure sustainability and its impact on institutional sustainability of municipalities so that they can sustain the ongoing provision of infrastructure-based services, we have to think then about municipalities themselves. We want to say that municipalities, as institutions now, are themselves vulnerable to climate change. They are vulnerable to the transition that the world is going through as a result of responding to climate change. That is in addition to the communities in the municipalities being vulnerable and the economies of the municipalities being vulnerable as institutions. So we've got to take that into account. Why am I saying that? It's because municipalities provide services using vast networks of infrastructure, which when providing these services, then they have to collect revenue based on the provision of services. So when this infrastructure is destroyed by the weather events associated with climate change, municipalities will not have revenue. They will not be able to provide services and collect revenue. In fact, they will probably not even be able to collect property rates, which is not related to provision of service, because communities will be revolting against municipalities that are not providing services. So we've got to pay attention to that. Secondly, in the context of municipality being vulnerable institutionally, that the transition that the world is implementing, if as a country, in this case, let's say as South Africa, we don't transition in tandem with the world, our economies are going to be vulnerable. So we have no option. We have to transition in tandem with the world. Because if we don't do that, it's going to result in economic disasters that are going to lead to the collapse of municipalities, that are going to lead to the collapse of social stability also in municipalities, which will lead to uprisings and vandalism of infrastructure that we see in many parts of at least South Africa now, where communities are feeling that municipalities are not able to be what they expect them to be. So it's something that we've got to pay attention to. So what have we been doing in a partnership with many organizations and national government is to support municipalities through various forms. There's quite been a lot of local government support programs that are trying to assist municipalities. To save time, I'm not going to go through all of them, those support programs. Among others, the Let's Respond toolkits, the guides to integration of climate change planning into statutory planning of municipalities and so on. But what I think I want to talk more about is then what has been the result of that. The result of that, I would say in the past 7 years, we have seen municipalities making climate change an issue of priority. We have seen metros establishing mechanisms, institutional mechanisms to implement responses to climate change. We have examples of municipalities such as Tshwane, Joburg, eThekwini, Cape Town, Ekurhuleni, that have developed ambitious climate change action plans and projects that are related to those plans. We have seen our cities participating in international partnerships, C40, ICLEI, and so on, learning from their peers elsewhere. What has it meant, though, in terms of the reality of infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure development in municipalities? We, despite that, I think when we took the plans, the infrastructure plans of municipalities and assessed them, we concluded that there's very little progress in respect of actual investment in sustainable infrastructure in a way that meets the 4 criteria that I spoke about. We got a sense that infrastructure management practitioners seem to be stuck and held back in what I can call business as usual in infrastructure development and maintenance, in respect of roads, in respect of transportation, in respect of waste management, water supply, and sanitation. But we also noticed, which is something to learn from, that there has been better progress in the energy sector. Why do we think was that progress? We think that it was inspired by changes in the regulatory environment, where municipalities had power, which relates to what Mayor Manuel is saying, to procure energy directly from independent power producers. The environment now allows, and municipalities are responding to that environment. In the past, they could only procure energy from Eskom in South Africa. The space is open for municipalities to partner with others to generate energy, and we see plans that are suggesting that municipalities are moving in that direction to be able to generate energy independently of what happens in Eskom. We see municipalities grappling with alternative revenue models in response to the energy sector, such as revenue that could be drawn from wheeling of energy from a generator to the user elsewhere in the municipal area. Now, with that, what needs to be done? Here are my 6 proposals.
Which we hope you can.
I'll be very quick. The first one is what Mayor Manuel has talked about. is the powers and functions that are related to built environment. If we were to develop infrastructure that is sustainable, we've got to have the authority to. The area of bulk raw water, for example, in South Africa, we've had cities that have faced day zero, in part because those who are supposed to be investing in bulk raw water have failed to do that, and it manifests in a city because you don't have dams that can supply the city with water that the city can purify and distribute, or you don't have water boards that can take dam water, purify, and give a city bulk water in order to distribute to the community. So you've got to deal with that. We have examples of municipalities such as Butterworth and Umnquma that for years has not had a sustainable supply of water because the dam silted, and those who are responsible for dams are not doing their part. So you just got to give these powers to where you have to. Human settlements development. You can't really plan for infrastructure if you have no control over the very core of managing human settlements. And it's managed in different bits and pieces. Somebody's doing housing elsewhere, somebody's overseeing land management, and so on elsewhere. Disaster management, where you have a situation where disaster management is a function of provincial and national government in terms of our constitution, yet the first responders to disaster is a municipality, and the municipality has no capability to invest in measures of mitigating the likely impacts of disasters because they don't have the resources and authority to do so. So the first part then is to go to that. It makes sense. The constitution says so, that where a power can best be performed at a local level, it must be devolved. But it's not happening. The second one is the regulatory environment for the built environment disciplines. I think an example was made earlier in the earlier session here, that most of our built environment disciplines are based on rules and environment that constrains creativity. There's a lot of how-tos that are set that our practitioners have to replicate. So we've got to create and allow for innovation there. The third one is to build institutional capacities of the cities. 4 elements related to that. 1, capable political leadership. Okay, capable political leadership. The capable political leadership is what we have seen. All parties, at least here in South Africa, they have their party hierarchy being duplicated in the government hierarchy. So the most junior in terms of party hierarchy, branch leaders, would end up being leaders of municipalities. Despite municipalities being so complex, you hardly find a national leader who is deployed to lead a municipality. It must be a local leader that must lead a municipality. You've got to look on the job training of practitioners, peer learning among practitioners, and creating knowledge platforms, which Manuel talked about. Quickly, the last few ones is direct access to funding, particularly climate funding. The second last being to create a conducive regulatory environment and institutional support environment for municipalities to get into partnerships. There's been a kind of averse attitude towards partnership, particularly private-public partnerships in our policy and institutional setup in South Africa, that even when there are opportunities that the private sector presents to partner with municipalities, procuring and implementing that is quite a complex, almost impossible thing to do. So we've got to look at that. And lastly, we've got to work on mobilizing communities to actively participate in shaping their transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mthobeli. Thank you so much, Mthobeli. What I'm picking up is this interlinkage between institutional sustainability of local governments and the ability to develop the right kind of infrastructure and sustain it. So thank you for that. Andrew, I think you're very well placed to close the loop for us because your having a foot in practice and another one in academia. So help us think about how we activate these partnerships that are going to empower and equip cities. Welcome.
Thanks, Amollo. In considering your question that you've got up there, I think three things matter. One, collaborative and adaptive leadership. Secondly, effective and enduring institutions. And three, relationships. I mentioned effective and enduring institutions, mindful of what Mark Swilling raised yesterday. One of the conditions of bankability is institutional coherence and appropriate governance. And on the relationship side, earlier in the program this morning, we talked about the importance of soft infrastructure for the soul, people, culture, beauty, and aesthetics. And at the heart of that are human and institutional relationships, and whether they are healthy relationships or whether they are toxic and abusive. But Amollo, I'd like to pose your question slightly differently, if you don't mind.
Welcome.
And I would say that the challenge is, how can local leaders work together to steer the transition towards sustainable infrastructure? Not just city government leaders, but community, civic, business, and academic leaders working with city governments, town governments, village governments. So I would begin with a whole of society approach rather than a public sector approach, particularly in cities where government either doesn't have the required mandates, and we've heard about different systems throughout Africa, or where the city government doesn't have the finances, or where or the capacity to deliver the infrastructure on its own. But even in the case of so-called empowered local authorities, which seemingly have the necessary powers, functions, and mandates, and finances, and capacity, I think we need to shift from this notion of the local state as, or the state as service deliverer, to the state as an enabler of development, so that we bring agency and reduce dependency back into the equation. And too often, we've experienced the opposite, the state as a disabler of development. Let me give you some examples here. And I'm not just talking about city level or municipal level government. These lessons are drawn from states as a whole. Okay? You know, states disable when there are command and control attitudes and behaviors. I'm the boss. You listen to me. Okay? When there's short-term thinking driven by electoral cycles and jockeying for power and opportunistic coalitions, which can fall apart from meeting to meeting. If there's a harsh winner-takes-all party political culture, where previous good work, planning and implementation, is swept away by the new incumbent and started again. That's destructive. And it can happen within the same party. It's not just regime change. When we have drivers of corruption entrenched in local political networks meshing with criminal syndicates, that's a disaster. Fragmented system governance with powers, functions, mandates, and finance split between different spheres or tiers of government. Particularly in our experience here in South Africa, the fragmented governance in our water system, in our energy system, in our food and nutrition system, in mobility and transport, and human settlements, deeply fragmented governance systems. So, Mthobeli, you talked about the importance of bringing together, from a point of view of spatial justice, where you live and how you get around, and those systems which conspire because they're fragmented to keep people in place. Other disablers of development are the existence of steep and inefficient hierarchies and silos, often fueled by institutional self-interest, an unfortunate obsession with titles, rank, status, and positions. When coordination is used as a mechanism of control rather than alignment and integration. Many examples of that. When there's an inward focus in the institution and upwards accountability to a political party or an auditor, rather than outwards focus and downwards accountability to communities. If we have monitoring and evaluating systems that reward process compliance and procedural compliance rather than societal outcomes, that's disabling. When we have reporting requirements that don't add value, and accounting officers that are risk avoiders, not problem solvers, if within the state there are negative and even hostile attitudes towards the role of civil society and the private sector, and a disregard for scientists and researchers and evidence in favor of a dogmatic party line, or even worse, a factional line within a party that happens to be ruling the state. Those are all disabling tendencies. And so consequently, even if we have coherent policies and frameworks and strategies and plans, and boy, we love our frameworks and strategies and plan, and even if those plans attract the necessary finance and are reinforced by appropriate technology, we still can get a crisis of implementation. If public sector leadership systems and cultures are not fit for purpose, are not enabling of development. But based on our experience over the last 20 years working in this intermediary space as a collaborative intermediary organization, there definitely are things we can do to create a more enabling public sector environment. It's not all doom and gloom. I'll just give 4 examples because of time. 1, start with the system and not the mandate, because mandatism is a killer. It's either that's my mandate, don't touch me on my mandate, or don't bring me your unfunded mandate. Equally bad, okay? So if you're starting with a system, one of the first things that you need to do is reveal the system to the stakeholders, including their own role in that system and the role of others, in both government and society. And the process as it unfolds with a systemic approach is to help your partners deliver on their mandates and influence beyond their mandates. And the thing that we've learned is that you cannot instruct or command influence. You need to be in a relationship, lots of relationships, in order to influence. Secondly, and this shares a lot in common with Liza's City Lab input, as well as Michael's mapping and storytelling earlier, we've found that a process of learning journeys that deliberately combine practitioners and change makers, researchers, and policymakers have impact. A local example that I can quote is the recent Nourish to Flourish local food system learning journeys. The sort of approaches embedded in that is, firstly, listen twice, talk once. Don't come with preconceived solutions. Focus initially on getting a common understanding of the problem together. focus less on what needs to be done and more on who needs to work together to make it happen, and how are you going to work together in practice? Because that's where we often fail. And finally, as a matter of course, involve young people in that process, rather than us old toppies, okay? Thirdly, create spaces and support for experimentation and risk-taking. That's easier said than done, particularly if there's a constrained political environment, which is very top-down and controlling, or where they have compliance processes that are too constrained. Sometimes you need to externalize the space for innovation through a partnering platform, which can then be looped back into government. And then fourthly, adaptive programming and delivery systems where you step into action and at the same time pause, reflect, learn, adapt and adjust and repeat. And I think a good example of this at the moment in South Africa certainly is the 800 million rand social employment fund, which is administered of all institutions by the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, very interestingly enough, in partnership with 28 civil society organizations, hundreds of grassroots, informal community structures, and 50,000 participants engaged in working for social value creation at a community level. And the Social Employment Fund, in turn, is backed up by a social employment support and learning network, which firstly provides a platform for peer-to-peer knowledge exchange and also feedback loops to government so that government can shift and adapt and adjust the program in real time, not at the end of it. So in conclusion, I would say, firstly, it's not enough to just create an enabling environment. We need to actively foster relationships between what we can call the bottom-up mobilizing environments, which can be agile, inventive, and participative, but can also be parochial, small-scale, and fragmented. So this relationship between the bottom-up mobilizing environments and the top-down authorizing environments, which can be blunt and ineffective, but possess the resources and the authority required to see the big picture, the strategic picture, and to implement at scale. And we need both of these environments. They both need each other. It's not either or, it's both and. And the objective is an iterative process based on achieving both functionality, in other words, constant small gains, and legitimacy, acceptance of the process and the outcomes by all. Partnering is not an end. It's a means towards an end. It's a means towards achieving improved and sustainable development outcomes, including the delivery of infrastructure. And the goal is to find real ways of achieving collaborative impact. And the trick here we have found is to seek the common agenda for joint action despite competing interests. And this means, as was said earlier, being able to deal affirmatively with difference, but also have an acute understanding of unequal power relations within these processes, dominant exclusionary narratives and how to change them and challenge them, and vested in competing interests. My final point, step into action as soon as possible. Don't spend too much time planning or collecting data. Trust is best built in action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for reframing that question and moving this from just a city government focus to a whole of society approach. And I think that's a great way for us to open the floor for comments. And we can take, I think, one round of questions and then allow our panelists to respond. We start from this side. Yes, there.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Yuli Sakani. not sure which title to use, but I'll stick with the chairperson of the South African Cities Network for now. Thank you so much for your thought-provoking presentations. I'm going to go to the last thing that you said, step into action immediately. Quite correct. But who must and how can they under the current circumstances? I bleed for people that are working at municipalities right now. I used to work for a municipality. We built things that are tangible. You can touch, you can see it, and really social justice to the greatest extent was achieved. Now walk into the shoes of a technical person or technocrat in a municipal environment now, where in probably 3 or 4 of our major metros, there's a political battle to unseat each other. What decisions are going to be taken under such circumstances? So my question is more for, we know what needs to be done, but how do we support the few that are left in that space? You know, when we were going through COVID, we often spoke about how to lead during turbulent times. That was a 2-3 year environment to deal with. This is every day. And it's been like this for the past, I don't know how many years. None of the things we are talking about today are achievable unless we support the few that are left there. It is debilitating, it is mortifying, and it is absolutely a shame.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohammed Gambo. My question more specifically goes to Mayor. From your experience and also from the rest of the panelists, in what way can we be able to have people with your kind of background, coming from, the professional background, having that vast experience, to be more involved in activities of, mayors, involved in the political cycle, for them, how can we be able to enhance that across cities in Africa? I think that's very, very important. And that interaction between, experts and the political cycle, there has to be that convergence. So how can it be inculcated and improved across African cities?
Thank you. The questions here.
Okay, so my name is Maarten Haier, Utrecht University. We did a research on neighborhoods for the future, and we found that neighborhoods that have developed really high-quality environments were all, the respondents there were all able to narrate what the quality of the neighborhood was. And we were wondering whether that storyline was actually steering events, so across organizations. And I was wondering if that, so on the one hand you would like a state to be restrictive and regulatory and so forth, but if that is perceived by other parties with money to be standing in the way of their contribution, then it may be that one has forgotten to jointly develop that storyline and then build up the regulation. So rather than making the plan as a state, it may be good to make that much more of a societal sort of endeavor, building up together that narrative. I was wondering whether that makes sense in the context of your experience.
Wow, I'm seeing so many hands up. I think we just do
The first round and then.
how many? Two or three? Three.
Hi, my name is Safia Abu. My question is for the gentleman from Salga, and it kind of extends to Yulisa's question in terms of all of the suggestions and all of the planning makes a lot of sense, and I completely subscribe to it. But from just a practical thing, from a partnering exercise, how do actually, with our current procurement system in South Africa, how does the private sector partner with the cities, given the current constraints we have with the way the procurement structure is currently set up, and what is being done from Salga's perspective or in the regulatory environment to facilitate this for it to be a little bit smoother and a little bit easier to allow for that engagement? Thanks.
Oh, all the hands disappeared. Okay. Oh, there's one here.
Yeah.
here, and then Mutiso first, and then here.
My name is Abdi, and my question is directed to the panel in general. So I'm just wondering about how do we kind of strike a balance between a sustainability agenda that requires more skills from the built environment profession, more planners, more designers, more architects, and a lived reality where the average person builds their own houses with the help of a carpenter or a builder, and who cannot afford to go through all the bureaucracies that needs to be created by these by creating this ecosystem of built environment professionals.
One last question.
Thank you. My name is Mutiso from the county government of Mombasa. And my question is really to all of us. How can we accelerate the use of technology in ensuring our infrastructural projects are more transparent and inclusive? And what are some of the examples you can have from South Africa and maybe the mayor? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just ask our panelists to perhaps reflect integratively to the questions, and also use this opportunity to give your closing reflections. We could start with you, Mayor.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting question. I think I will try to link the last question with one from my brother there. How do we bring in the private sector, bring in civil society, and other stakeholders? My take is that local government has to do with autarky. And for those who did Greek or Latin, means something close. So the whole concept and the advantage that local government has got over national government is there are two issues. One, the issue of proximity. Like the mayor, local government, they are there. And the advantage of decentralization over centralization is the fact that if there is 1 meter bottom hole, the mayor, when he's moving from home to go to office, he sees it. When he arrives at the office, or even before he arrives at the office, he can text a message to his staff so that they can deal with that bottom hole. The disadvantage of a centralized government, and in Mozambique we had a planning economy for several years, was that the role of the local administrator was to register the potholes, measure them, and send to the central planning unity. We had Comissão Nacional de Plano, the National Commission of Planning. So all the potholes from all the country will have to go to Maputo, centralized, and then money be sent. And the problem is that because they are waiting for all the bottom hole from all the places to come to Maputo, by the time money is sent, that borehole, which was 1 meter, now is 2 meters. So the money which arrives is not enough to deal with it. So then it will have to be postponed for the following year. And so that process goes. And that's where I really like, local governments. So the issue of proximity. And it's like if you as a mayor take a bad decision, the following morning when you go to the street, you feel it. Because the citizens, they will not smile at you. When you are passing, they look the other way around, like, oh, okay, there is something I did wrong. It's proximity. And the other is what I call reinforced legitimacy. Because it's like you are elected by your peers. Most of the times, like in my country, I think here too, the members of parliament, they are elected via a list. Like you don't even know who is in that list. It's the party who decides who is getting in the list and who. This is I like the two issues. That's why I think it should be very easy. And we should work to make sure that those who live in that autarky, they actively participate in the process. So the whole concept of participatory planning, the whole concept of participatory budgeting, I didn't learn from school. It was a challenge that I faced because when I ran as a mayor, I was elected myself. I didn't have a bench because it was a by-election. So I had 2 years that I had to run my city without a bench. So of course, the first draft of budget I submitted, it did not pass. Of course, I didn't have a bench. It was the ruling party and the other party. So what did I do? I said, well, the only way I can survive here is to blackmail them. Positively, of course. I went to them and I said, look, if by the second time you don't approve my budget, well, the law requires that we go for, like the assembly, municipal assembly is, how do you say it? So, like it stops working and then they need to be dissolved. They need to be elected. And I'm not sure you will keep your seats. Because I'm coming, I was elected, I will take most of those seats. But even you are not secure that your party leadership will put you by the same order. So it's on your own interest so that we move together until the end of this mandate. Second, I went to the villagers, to the citizens, say, look, those guys, they rejected, they did not approve the budget I submitted. Therefore, this is your budget. Let's demonstrate. Let's go to the street and demonstrate, look, we want that budget. So I played the two games by bringing in the citizens to the streets, but also by blackmail them that it was on their own interest. So when I resubmitted it, of course, it was approved by 100%. So from there, I learned that I need to consult. I need to have the citizen with me because they are the ones who protect my mandate. Once the citizens feel and they are consulted, then they own it. They are willing to participate. But of course, you need to be very, very careful because sometimes we exceeded. Like we went there the first time, we didn't know the rules, and we opened the Pandora box, and they wanted all bridges, they wanted roads, and like the budget could not accommodate. So you need to limit the democraticity of the process. But again, as I said before, to my country, or most of the countries, there is a natural process of migration. This is part of the history. From a rural area to the city, because the dream of a city attracts those in the rural area. So migration from rural area to the city is one thing which happened, but also for secondary cities to the main cities. And for the case of my city, they either used to go to Nampula, to Beira, but most of them to Maputo. So we need to find ways of involving them, but also they need to see that there is a future in the city. There is a space for them, and they do participate in the process of taking decisions, be in the planning process, be in the budgeting process. And also, if possible, it's very important, as Professor said there, we need to find ways so that they participate in the monitoring of the process. They need to be part and parcel of the decision-making, the implementation, and also in the evaluation process. Because municipal assemblies are not enough. Because most of the times, we are happy. So, well, we have the executive, we have the municipal assembly, well, it's not enough. We need to find innovative ways to involve other stakeholders, be the private sector, civil society, but most importantly, I think universities. It's very important because universities have got the knowledge, the capacity to capacitate in different areas, be it in planning, be it as engineers, be it on environment, and so on. There is a lot of knowledge sitting in the shelves of universities, which cities need. And unfortunately, cities don't have the money to hire consultants and so on. So I think the most sustainable way is this cooperation between cities and universities. It's cheaper. Yes, because we don't have money. We don't have money to pay like those consultant fees. Like a professor can send his students to go and do the preliminary work at the given city and so on. That collaboration, I think it's very, very important. But my point, just to finalize, is the issue of capacity is very, very, very important.
Thank you, Manuel. I think another question you'll have to take offline is how we get more people from London to become city mayors in Africa.
I mean, when I
we'll
decided,
take it offline.
No, just to finish.
Oh my God.
When I decided to run, my colleagues, they all said that I was crazy. Well, I'm a bit crazy, but not that much. But they called me that I was crazy. They say that. So, I mean, how can you? At least they expected me to. I could leave London in their view, but at least to stop in Maputo, not to go to like a small place lost somewhere. But this answers what the professor said here. About it was my brother from Salga, about the parallel structures of the party and government. It's like the party normally leave those guys who are less qualified to manage cities because of that hierarchy. That's why I won the 3 elections, because I inverted that hierarchy in terms of competence. I went where they wouldn't go. Of course, now I don't have a challenger, which is bad for democracy, but I love it anyway.
Thank you so much, Mayor. So we'll just leave it to Mthobeli and Andrew to close it for us so that we can go for lunch.
Thank you. Being sensitive of my time debt, I will just focus on just one question that was directed at me. Creating an environment for partnerships, particularly with private sector. What Salga has been doing, that was the question. The first part of it was to get the leadership of local government to acknowledge that there is a need for this partnership. So what we did was, when we had the national conference of all leaders, mayors, speakers, municipal managers, and so on, was to get to have an honest discussion. Are we capable, as this collective, to resolve the issues of infrastructure, services, and delivery in South Africa all by ourselves? Do we have the wherewithal, the resources, and the people to do that? And the acknowledgement was, we just don't. We need to partner with others. So getting that to be something that is agreed upon by all, that our solution lies with us partnering with others, was a very important one for us as a starting point. The second part was then, what then constrains getting into these partnerships? That's the work that we are currently doing, reviewing the institutional frameworks and the regulatory environment to say, this is what government needs to change in order to create a more enabling environment for that. That's the work that is currently taking place. Thirdly, we had to start having convinced ourselves as local government. We then have to talk to those who regulate us to say, there is a need to actively foster partnerships between local government and not just private sector, even communities. Sometimes communities want to work with us to solve their own problems, and you have a system that forces you to think about that from the point of view of procurement. To say, if you are going to spend jointly with supporting a community to give you more than you could do if you were doing it yourself, then the question is, how did you decide on partnering with this organization vis-a-vis the other organization? So we thought it's important to get that. So we went to the Treasury organized budget lekgotla to make this point about creating and enabling an environment and realizing that local government all by itself will not solve the problems of socio-economic development at the local level. Convince everyone around that. We think that we achieved that. Now it's about the actual work now, saying these are the things that need to be changed in our policies, in our legislation, in our support institutions in order for us to foster a partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, just a few wise words to finish us off.
I don't know how wise they are, Amollo, but can I start with a question around the sustainability agenda?
And could we maybe just conclude and answer the one question, or you want to deal with them integratively?
I'm going to try and pick up on a number of questions, if that's okay.
Try and integrate the answer.
So, yeah, the sustainability agenda is a complex one. And a sustainability agenda that is going to be a just transition, is even more complex. Okay. It has a whole bunch of unknowns. There's a lot of data we don't even know. And it's taking place in a low trust, low agreement environment, which is highly unequal. I mean, the transition has already started, and it is not bending in the right direction. It's not as though we're waiting for it to start or we're going to start it. It's already happening, and it's already going in the wrong direction. So how do we bend the curve back in a more progressive direction? So there's no choice but to take an adaptive and collaborative approach. There's no choice but to take a whole of government, whole of society approach. The notion of the state as a set of relationships rather than just a legal and constitutional thing. And so to do that, Mayor, you talked about capacity. I would add we also need capabilities. And slightly different from the capacity issue. So what are the capabilities of collaborative and adaptive leadership? It's to understand and communicate the big picture. It's to create a compelling vision that motivates participation and commitment. And these are leaders not just in government, but throughout society, to work in partnership with diverse organizations and deal affirmatively with that difference that is embedded in the system, to foster a sense of joint ownership and collective responsibility and seek win-win solutions. Those are some of the capabilities of collaborative and adaptive leadership that we need to have. So I just conclude by giving a concrete example. Typically, and unfortunately, a lot of public sector planning processes start within the state, prepared internally, a plan. It's sanctioned politically before it is discussed externally. The external engagements are often quite cynical tick box exercises simply to avoid court challenges down the line. And then it's brought back into the state for government to implement. And one recent refreshing example that is completely contrary to that is the work of in South Africa, the Presidential Climate Commission. Firstly, the commission itself is not a government body. It has 10 cabinet ministers on it, but 28 reps drawn from different parts of society. And secondly, they went out on I think, a very genuine engagement process. And thirdly, if you look at the Just Transition Framework, it doesn't just say government must do this, or just government and sub-national government must do that. It starts spelling out a role for communities, for neighborhoods, for labor, for academics and scientists, and for business. So at last, we're starting to get to a whole of society, whole of government approach codified in a government planning process. And that's a good first step. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So much for my sending one question via WhatsApp last night. Thank you so much for the vibrant discussions, and we can finish here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amollo, and the panel. So just housekeeping, we'll be back at 2 o'clock sharp to start. We won't end later than the program says. If I could just ask for the final panel, Sue, have you been able to speak to everyone? Where's Sue? Sue's not here. Okay. So, okay, she's not here. So that's a hard no, I suspect. So please be back by 2 so that we can start punctually at 2 and then we can finish on time. Have a bit of a breather before the book launch at 4:30. Thank you.